I'm standing in our neighbor's driveway looking into our chicken yard and just beginning the process of looking at their lawn space where we're going to be developing a food forest alongside our own. And so in this video, what I'd like to do is share notes on how I would do an initial analysis and an assessment of what's going on in a landscape to think through what are the plants that we want to put in, what are the appropriate ways to go about it, and how do we get started. We've been developing our little half acre for about 7 years now, so we're pretty well packed. In fact, we're overflowing with some plants, and that's part of what prompted this idea. Also to have just more resiliency and food in the landscape around us, and to help our neighbors have more beautiful, productive things going on and more reasons for us all to connect. So I have the benefit of knowing what works in our landscape, and this is so close that we know that if we put in seaberry, elderberry, currants, hazelnut, they all work very well. But what we're dealing with here fundamentally is a pretty moist, gently north-facing slope. So right now I'm looking due south, and that goes upslope. We're at 1,200 foot elevation, and we've got a lot of sun in the main open area, which we'll look at in a moment, but also some shaded conditions that are worth designing for. Same position, but if I'm looking due north towards the busy road, you can see, even without leaves on them, there are some trees in here that cast quite a bit of shade. This is a pin oak that really protects our chicken coop from being hot in the summer, but will also put a whole lot of shade and probably some root competition into this area. So this is a slightly different design area to work with. We also have a neighbor to the east who has a whole bunch of pine and spruce. So there's not a lot of very early morning sun in this area. It's a little bit of a microclimate of cool, shaded, almost like a woodland edge context. You can almost see as well, there's a slight vein. This is particularly wet right in this area. So one of the things that I think I'll take from that, I'm gonna cup this phone so I don't get as much wind in here, is to not plant in the absolute wettest spots. And what that will do is give us the option later on to do some trenching work and harvest some soil out from there. So we won't plant in the wettest, but we'll plant nearby. And in this area, I can imagine black currants in particular doing quite well. And we might try to go for some privacy plants right along the road. I can see as well some little minor indentations where water runs once in a while. So again, where it's the absolute most wet, those are areas we'll design around. We'll just have wet walkways for now, with the idea that it reserves the option of digging them out to harvest more soil and release water later on. And if you look just into our garden, that's a plan or a pattern we've used extensively, with little hand-dug ponds all throughout and little trenches and waterways that this time of year have water and silt moving through them. In the summer, they're a little bit drier and easier to work with. But there's a lot more physical texture in our garden from all of the harvesting of walkways and building up beds. This area is flatter. We also don't want to have to modify it a whole lot. Here on the southern edge of our property where our fence ends, little drainage ditch that I dug to take some of this surface water that moves through this property and send it into ponds. We've got some black currants and elder already planted here, and this is certainly the warmer and sunnier space. There's a tremendous amount of light access in here, so it opens up the opportunity for more sun-loving plants. I imagine this whole area being very appropriate for seaberry or sea buckthorn, and we've learned over time that that is a very much sun-loving plant, but also very tolerant of wet, clayey soils, which is what we have. In fact, you can see them growing like gangbusters just a few feet on our side, air quotes. So I think we can dig up some of these. We can take runners and suckers and propagation points and install them into this landscape without a whole lot of fuss. And hazelnut seems to be doing really well in our property, so we'd like to move that out here too. Very clearly, this is an extremely wet part of the lawn, and this begins where water drains through on the west side of our garden. And right next to that waterway is a hazel shrub that is doing quite well for itself. It's spreading and suckering, and its roots are right down there in the muck, which is great news for us. We can take seedlings and set them out. So following those patterns without overthinking it too much, what we can do is start from the fence line and running in line with what we already have, so we maintain some access. we can think about a narrow, permanent walkway that we can either lay hay on there or sheet mulch with cardboard and wood chips, but that can be done later, and plant our first row of parallel crops that are running more or less on contour. I imagine the first row thinking through something that doesn't get too tall, because we don't want shade cast deep into our garden. So we wouldn't put apple trees or English walnuts or very tall plants here, but maybe we would do an overall design that has shrubs that get taller and taller over time and then come back down again, thinking through light access, a little bit more shade loving or shade tolerant over here, taller in the middle, lower again, nice shelter belt. Just a rough idea, but what I think we can start with is who are the shrub layers that can go in this first line. And I imagine seaberry and hazelnut in little clumps for pollination right down this line would work just fine. There's also the reality that for the initial planting, there's gonna be a whole lot more lawn in between these plants. We're not gonna plant them 1 foot apart. And so what we can do is plant them in line with the spacings we want, erring a little on the closer than usual side. And then in between, we can sheet mulch a bit with cardboard, dump a little bit of compost, and try some sort of sprawling vine. There's no guarantee that that's gonna work, but we could try some winter squash in there just as a cover or a spreading plant, or perhaps even sow in some amaranth or corn into little lumps of compost so we can get annuals growing in between the perennials to occupy the space as much as possible. The more we can have growing over this lawn, the less we have to fight and manage that lawn. There's also this random thicket that was here, or is here, pretty chaotic, and what I'm seeing in here, cast of characters wise, is Japanese honeysuckle, European buckthorn, and white ash. The ash is kind of nice, maybe we would work around that, but the rest of these shrubs can go, and perhaps we would leave the ash actually as a trellis and consider once these are cleared out, we can plant a perennial vine to climb up the ash and manage that as a pollard. But I think we can work around this for now. We don't have to change this scenario, but just know that we could plant that out to something else, and certainly modifying this mess and switching it out for more productive shrubs would be pretty reasonable. So I'll keep that in mind. And what we want to avoid is randomly putting plants all throughout this massive area. That makes for miserable time trying to mow and manage while they establish and fill out and close canopy. Rather, what we're going to be doing is planting one row, mulching another row, and slowly but surely creeping away from the occupied space of food forest in our garden and removing lawn piece by piece as we go. He has a big, strong mower, and if we don't get the whole place planted out, the last thing he'd want to have to do is then go through a maze of all of these plants, avoiding and being nervous about hitting a young tree. So we're going to keep it a contiguous planting block that we just continually add, almost like an island effect of taking the lawn over. And that should make the overall management picture a lot easier. And what we agreed on was that basically from our fence line, we would plant densely and line by line by line, move up the lawn until roughly about here. And that would keep us quite busy between the installation, the management, and the upkeep for year 1, year 2. This area in the future could be something else. He also indicated he might be interested in having sheep someday. So maybe we're planting out some willows and poplars in this mix that we could cut for tree hay for them. Lots of options that we can look at. In some ways, it's almost too many options, but then once we start planting, we can always cut things as a chop and drop to feed other plants, or we can always work around them and just get on with it and add more plants elsewhere. I'd rather have trees in the ground not in the ideal spot than wait 3 years to find the ideal spot and then put a tree there. More trees is always better. We heat with wood, we grow mushrooms on logs. There's all sorts of uses for an inappropriate tree 10 years down the road. I think the place that we'll start is right down by the road. He definitely indicated that having privacy, more privacy from the road would be really nice for him. So getting that tackled right out of the gate feels nice to do. We've got a ton of propagation material very nearby in the form of willow, currants, and elders that are all around here. And with this shade, I feel like the currants are going to be the dominant ingredient. Maybe some trees that we can coppice and pollard to manage a visual barrier. but set in far enough from the road so it's safe for them to come and go with their car. So I think what we'll do is just get started with that, and in the meantime keep in the back of our mind what all the other areas can be and how they'll evolve. We don't have to have the full 50-year game plan fully realized before the first tree goes in the ground. We can just start planting and then figure it out as we go. So that's what we're going to do.